And hence even politicians and media commentators who decried Israel's actions as quote-unquote disproportionate, in effect only reinforced the public's perception of Israel's actions as defensive in nature. So much of what passes for accepted wisdom with regards to this issue is simply incorrect. It is not a conflict between two sides in the manner in which it is presented. It is the ongoing oppression of the mostly unarmed indigenous people of that land by one of the most powerful militaries in the world. It is not even fundamentally a conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, because if the will exists, which is admittedly a big if, it would be perfectly possible to find ways for all Palestinians and Israelis to live together in peace, harmony and dignity. It is fundamentally a conflict between a military colonial enterprise to establish an ethnically pure Jewish state on historic Palestine and the basic human rights of the indigenous population. The Israeli public are themselves victims of a society that has become completely lost in the web of its own propaganda lies and addicted to the potent drugs of nationalism, militarism and state violence. Polls carried out in Israel show that 86% of the Israeli general public were angry with their government for not continuing the attacks on Gaza for longer, and felt that the Israeli military hadn't gone far enough. Only 4% of the Israeli public opposed the attacks on Gaza altogether, and many of them have expressed the fear that they themselves experience in a society which views principled dissent as treachery, and they certainly deserve our support and solidarity also. An enlightened compassion for the Israelis would require of our political leaders that they recognise how dangerously deluded the Israelis have become and try to shake them out of it. However, there seems to be little hope of that, given that most of our political leaders are themselves both victims and perpetrators of the same propaganda lies, to a greater or lesser extent in individual cases, obviously. And if you think that this issue, though deeply tragic for those immediately caught up in it, such as the 800,000 children living in Gaza, has little or no implication for those of us living outside of that immediate area, think again. Because this issue has ramifications and consequences that go far beyond the immediate sphere of Israel, Gaza and the West Bank, in a way that other instances of oppression and dispossession, though deeply tragic in their own right and deserving of our concern, for the most part don't. One of the most serious of these is the continual and ongoing undermining and erosion of the status of international law through America's veto of Security Council resolutions critical of Israel on over 40 occasions, that has allowed Israel to continue its illegal occupation of land conquered by force with complete impunity. Israel is also undermining international humanitarian law in both word and deed in a very deliberate and systematic manner in what they refer to as lawfare. One of the leading figures in this undertaking is Asa Kasher, a professor of philosophy and practical ethics at Tel Aviv University, who has boldly declared that it is both appropriate and understandable for Israel to be leading the campaign to remove the protections enjoyed by non-combatant civilians, and expresses his hope that Israel's doctrine of blurring the distinction between combatants and non-combatants will come to be incorporated into international law. The doctrine to which he refers has been explained in the words of Major General Giora Elad, quote, harming the civilian population to such an extent that it will bring pressure to bear on the enemy combatants. The Israeli strategy of seeking acceptability for its actions essentially consists of repeating illegal acts while simultaneously justifying them robustly in the language of what they refer to as new military ethics. And just as Israel exports and profits from its expertise in tactics of oppression by providing training and advice to police forces and security services throughout the world, it likewise profits from exporting its expertise in using public relations techniques and alternative interpretations of the law to provide propaganda cover for violations of international law and international humanitarian law carried out by other brutal regimes. And without meaningful international law and international humanitarian law and a broad consensus among the major nations of the world that they should be honoured for the sake of our collective well-being as a global community, there is only the law of the jungle, the rule of military force or the threat of military force, with all of the terrible consequences that that has for the continual erosion of trust and harmony between the nations of the world and the continual and ongoing emphasis on the development and acquisition of deadly weaponry amongst both governments and resistance groups at the expense of programs of social welfare for their respective populations, such as health and education, and the type of global cooperation and collaboration that we really need to see in order to tackle vitally important issues that will affect all of us, that can only be resolved through such collaboration, such as global warming. The credibility of the concept of human rights itself is on the line, because for as long as Western countries such as Britain and America condone and defend Israeli human rights violations, their talk about the importance of human rights with respect to other countries will be perceived by most of the rest of the world as merely a tool of political manipulation, used selectively and cynically for the furtherance of their own political ends. A point that has been well explained by John Dugard, South African professor of international law, who in 2007 wrote, quote, "The West cannot expect the rest of the world to take issues it regards important seriously if it persists in its present attitude to the Israeli occupation. For the rest of the world, the issue of Palestine has become the litmus test for human rights. If the West fails to show concern for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, the rest of the world will conclude that human rights are a tool employed by the West against regimes it dislikes and not an objective and universal instrument for the measurement of the treatment of people throughout the world." The Israeli government uses many methods to try to discredit its critics, including the accusation that we are anti-Semites, an extremely heavy, serious, and indeed intimidating accusation, given the associations that it obviously has with the horrors of the Holocaust, and one which on many occasions succeeds in its desired effect of silencing critics or potential critics. But the Israeli government does not speak for or represent all Jewish people, and in any case, criticism of the current policies of a particular country cannot be likened to or equated with prejudice and hatred towards a particular religious or ethnic group. They are just two completely different things. And in reality, there is a very broad spectrum of opinion among Jewish people throughout the world about the state of Israel, with many of them feeling pretty much disinterested in the whole issue. Furthermore, Jewish people are and have always been at the forefront of the Palestinian rights movement, and many of the most informed and eloquent speakers about this issue are Jewish themselves. They reject the idea that the historical and persecution and suffering of Jewish people gives the Israeli government and army the right to oppress and dispossess the Palestinians, the original inhabitants of the land that they occupy, whose families have lived on that land for thousands of years. They affirm that which is best in the Jewish ethical tradition and insist that the term "never again" that is frequently used with respect to the Holocaust should mean never again for anyone. They appeal to people of conscience throughout the world to support the Palestinians in their legitimate demands for freedom, justice, and basic human rights, and to recognise the dangers to all of us of passively allowing the ongoing undermining of international law and erosion of respect for international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights that is a consequence of Israel's ability to break international law, international humanitarian law, and continually deny the Palestinians their basic human rights with complete impunity. As Jeff Halper, an American-Israeli Jew and founder of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, put it to our group of Palestine Solidarity Campaign activists when he spoke to us at our National Lobby of Parliament for Palestine in November 2012. This isn't just about the Palestinians. It's also about the type of world we all want to live in. Thanks very much for listening.
Cheers, thank you.